who've been telling us about the impacts of climate change for a long time, but they finally said, okay guys, so we basically have 12 years in order for us to cut our emissions from 2010 levels to half by 2030. And like was mentioned, that's going to take a lot of work. And this slide, there's a lot on here, and visually it looks crazy, and that's sort of the situation that we're in right now. So what does that mean? And this is a clip from a video that was created by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in collaboration with others, just saying, as Dr. Toji said, that we really need to change everything. We need to change the way our economy runs. And that's sort of the backdrop of the situation that led to the creation of the Green New Deal and the way it was constructed. The Green New Deal is a 10-year plan to invest in a massive drawdown of greenhouse gas emissions while creating jobs and expanding social programs. And it was a resolution that was introduced earlier this year, and it was a non-binding resolution, which means that it wouldn't have actually required anyone to implement anything. And unsurprisingly, it actually didn't pass the Senate, and people knew that. But the point right now isn't that we have, a legislative package that is going to, pass through Congress at this very moment. The point right now is that we're all talking about this issue, and that we're all learning about how the climate crisis is connected to all these other issues, and that we start mobilizing support to advance something like the Green New Deal to address this crisis in a really sort of cohesive way. And this is the first time that any sort of climate legislation has been introduced that talks about all of these facets, talks about the issue of climate change and the technical issue of having to draw down greenhouse gas emissions, talks about the issue of environmental justice, racial and economic justice, talks about the concerns of rural communities, as well as the need for Medicare and adequate housing for all people. So it's sort of a comprehensive package of these components. And so with that, I'll talk about the 5 main goals that are outlined in the Green New Deal resolution. The first is that it would achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition. And as was mentioned, in order for us to reach net zero, we're going to need to change how we get our energy, transition to renewable energy. We're going to need to invest in energy efficiency. We're going to need to invest in electric vehicles and public transportation. We're going to need to do all of that. And we're also going to need to focus on what's called a fair and just transition, which is that there are people who work in oil and gas industries and other extractive industries that we're going to have to phase out, and we can't leave those workers behind. So the Green New Deal emphasizes the need for federal jobs guarantee for those industries that are going to have to phase out its workers. So the second goal is to create millions of good high-wage jobs to ensure economic security. All of the projects that I mentioned, energy efficiency, renewables, all of those are going to create jobs. And the Green New Deal emphasizes the need for those to be high-wage, unionized jobs. And the third goal is to invest in the infrastructure and industry of the country to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And that, of course, is also a jobs generator, but it's important because we know climate change is happening. We need to make sure that all of our infrastructure is ready to handle the impacts of floods, fires, etc., that we know are going to happen across the country. Fourth goal, secure clean air and water, access to healthy food, nature, etc. And there are also projects related to that, related to upgrading water infrastructure, related to restoring ecosystems, related to generating, advancing more sustainable agriculture that preserves the soil, that are part of accomplishing this goal. And then the fifth goal is promoting justice and equity by stopping the oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. And that's something that's key, that's part of the Green New Deal. Basically what this is saying is no more sacrifice zones. We can't continue to have a Torrance refinery. We can't continue to have Tesoro. We can't continue to have oil and gas infrastructure where we're living. And this is a key component of what the Green New Deal is saying, that we can't do this to frontline communities anymore. And another important component, as I mentioned, is that it's not an official, like one of the 5 main goals, but it makes it clear that the Green New Deal would, as part of it, require healthcare, Medicare for all, and adequate and affordable housing for all people, because those are also connected to, like everything else, connected to climate impacts. People who don't have adequate housing or healthcare are going to be the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And in relation to, so the Green New Deal, that terminology borrows from the first New Deal that was introduced and implemented by the FDR administration to get this country out of the Great Depression. And that was successful in terms of creating a middle class in this country, but that was a white middle class that was created. It didn't do much for, if anything, for working class Black families. It didn't do much for other people of color, in terms of advancing them out of poverty. And the Green New Deal emphasizes that can't happen. For this thing to be designed and implemented, there need to be democratic and participatory processes that are led by frontline communities and workers that would be affected by this transition, and that the projects that are implemented as part of the Green New Deal would be defined and developed by the communities themselves. And lastly, and very importantly, that the Green New Deal would require respecting Indigenous sovereignty and land rights and honoring treaties and agreements that the U.S. has made to these to Indigenous communities, which we know they've never properly honored and respected. So that's a lot of information that I just shared about the Green New Deal, and a lot of people, and maybe some people in the room are thinking that's a lot of stuff and it's too big, it's too fast, it's going to be really expensive. But I think and hopefully what some of you think in this room is that the Green New Deal is expansive because the problems that we're dealing with are themselves expansive. The solutions have to be expansive to meet the problems at hand. It's not just about a technical fix, it's about addressing all of the components of racial, environmental, economic injustice that is directly baked into the issue of the climate crisis. And secondly, the cost of not doing anything is so much larger than the cost of doing something right now to prevent foreseeable disasters. And then the last slide related to that is that not only is it necessary kind of economically to preventatively and preemptively address the issues that we know are coming, but it's really a moral obligation as people who have a voice, as people who are constituents of elected officials who could do something to say we need this because we know that these problems are not far off the horizon. We know that our children and their children, future generations, we know that even the people who are alive today are going to be impacted by the issue of climate change. And if we can do something now, it's sort of a moral obligation for anyone who can to rise to the challenge that we are seeing and to do something. And that something is really clearly presented in this package of a Green New Deal that people across the country are working to elevate, and to mobilize people around. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Andrew, who's going to talk about the Sunrise Movement, the group that we're both volunteers of, which has been really instrumental in elevating this concept of the Green New Deal and mobilizing people to know about it and to act about it. So he'll give some info on what Sunrise has done so far and how you guys can all kind of plug in.
Hold on 1 second. Okay, cool. So this is the home stretch. I think I'm the last speaker. So I just want to start off with saying thanks everyone for coming. I'm originally from Indiana, and so if you look around, like there are more Asians here than in my 3,000 person high school. So this is really powerful for me. So to get started, I got into the environmental movement because the last 2 places I've called home, which would be the Midwest, Hawaii, and California, have already seen the effects of climate change. So in the Midwest, we just had the polar vortex this past year, which brought temperatures down to I think -40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. And then in Hawaii, like we've talked about before, the coasts are already rising. There's flooding every year, and it's more frequent and more devastating than ever. And then California, you all know, we've had the drought, and then we've had these fires that are going to keep getting worse and keep getting more destructive. And the one thing that I notice about all of these is that the solutions are never really helping anyone of the most disenfranchised folks, the people of color. They're always the ones left out to dry in this, and it's going to keep working like that unless we change it. So what is the Sunrise Movement? A really generic, quick definition is we're a young movement that's aiming to get millions of youths activated and then fight to get politicians talking about climate change and actually having policy to fight it. So we started in April of 2017 with about 5 chapters, and as of today I think we have over 200. And the LA chapter has 100 active members, and then over 1,000 members in our network working to basically get the word out and then move forward with elections to get the right people involved. So our goal, like I said, is to get this talked about, and then after we get it talked about, to start having actions to force our politicians to move it forward, to force the media to actually talk about it, and get this done in 12 years, because that's all we have. So our first action that kind of put us on the map was we stormed Nancy Pelosi's office. There was 250 of us, and we sat in and basically demanded, hey, like, we need every Democrat to basically sign a no fossil fuel pledge, which means we don't want you taking any money from the oil industry, and we want you guys to actually take this seriously, because as we all know, especially in California, it's the same in Hawaii, being a Democrat doesn't mean you're actually caring about the environment. You could be a corporate Dem, you can still take money from any of the places that, like BP, any fossil fuel industry. And so, if we go to the next slide, there was over 50 people arrested, but what we got out of that was, first of all, Nancy Pelosi reinstated the Climate Crisis Committee, and then we've also gotten over 1,400 politicians around the country and the world to take the no fossil fuel pledge, and as you've kind of seen, it's entered into the primaries, and so we're really hoping to keep pushing that forward. So then, more locally, what we've done is we've gone to some Stand LA actions, and as we've stated before, the goal of Stand LA is to make sure that we get oil drilling out of LA, because we've seen the health problems, we've seen just like the devastation it can have, and more specifically, just like everywhere else, they put the drilling in the poorest communities because there's not enough people to fight back, and they know that, and it's really evil. And then with the climate strike, this was on March 15th, and it was a bunch of young people, like we had like people as young as like 7 or 8, and they took the day off of school, they took the day off of work to protest, basically saying like we need radical changes, because it's no longer about like our children's children or our children, like it's our lives and it's gonna happen in our lifetime. Last week, I don't know if anyone was able to make it, but we had a Green New Deal Roadshow, which basically brought together artists, activists, and politicians to talk about, you know, what this means and how we can work together, specifically in LA, to get this moving. This is Kaniela Ng, who I actually had the pleasure of volunteering with on his campaign. He's a Hawaiian, local, like Kanaka Maoli Hawaiian, who's a politician in Hawaii. He took the no fossil fuel pledge, as well as he has some really interesting thoughts on, you know, like Hawaii in, I think it was the 1700s, had 1 million people on Oahu, and they were able to be self-sustainable, they were able to not have any imports, and they were having no like CO2 emission. And nowadays, I think that if the port got shut off, Hawaii, like Oahu, has 4 days before they're out of food. And so basically, like, we like to think that we're modern, we like to think that we know what's going on, but like the native Hawaiians knew exactly what was going on and how to be sustainable. And so as we move forward, I think it's important to remember that like we've had communities before that were able to sustain this earth, and it's only recently that it's all changed. So the next one. So to get this all working, Sunrise needs 3 key ingredients. So the first one's people power. We need to activate as many people as we can. We need like millions of people, especially in the US, to really push this forward. The next one is political power. So that means electing a critical mass of politicians who are on our side and have our back. And then finally, like Lally said, this is a massive issue. So we need to align all the people's movements, because this isn't about saving the earth, this is about saving humanity. So everyone's going to be affected by it. And then I'm gonna kind of break down what Sunrise wants to do over the next few years because it can seem really big and broad. So right now we're in phase 1, which is just all of 2019. We're trying to activate as many people. We're also trying to get this no fossil fuel money pledge because as great as it is and as radical as like Fox News wants to make it seem, this is like the first step and like just where we need to start. And then like we had the Green New Deal Roadshow, we're doing tours and just trying to get as many people activated. So in our next phase, which would be the first half of 2020, is we want to make sure that all the Democratic primary candidates have supported the Green New Deal, and not just like a corporate version of it, like an actual Green New Deal that has the correct timeline. I know LA released one that had things by like 2040, which at that point, it doesn't even matter. And then also we want to team up with other groups to start mobilizing for the actual general election. So in phase 3, we're going to be at the last half, June 2020, November 2020. We're going to reach out to our networks, make sure people are out there voting, get Trump out of office, and put an end to fascism once and for all. So this will be a really powerful phase, but the really important one to me is phase 4, which is that we lead the most massive acts of non-cooperation and we actually push the elected officials to do what they said. Because just because we get them up there, like this is all grassroots, so we need to keep pushing them and moving forward with that. So if any of this was interesting to you, if you want to learn more, we actually have a hub meeting tomorrow from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Brewery Artist Lofts. And then we also, if you want to meet with me or Lally or Javier in the back, we can talk with you after this of how to get involved. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean and Andrew and Lally. So right now we're going to watch a really quick video to help us get a little bit more energized for the next part of our program, which is the really fun part and the most important part of our program. We're going to be breaking out into groups and discussing some of the things we can do from here. And so I'm gonna let